Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us. This is the last session in this sub-series on Marx and party building. And we want to take one final look in our final session on the Bolshevik party. And has everything we've talked about in this series so far was very much focused on the Social Democratic Party of Germany. Because Marx was involved in setting that up, etc., and was very much involved in the writing of various program drafts and discussions, etc. There's a sort of discussion or a sort of idea which is very prominent on the left that the Bolsheviks basically had nothing to do with what went on before in Germany. I mean, they were, friendly, etc., but this was a party of a new type. The Bolsheviks, totally different, tight, run by professionals, centralistic, lack of democracy, etc. Totally different to what went before. And we want to examine that today, and also then examine how that program, leading from the Social Democratic Party, somewhat, is there a continuation to, the Russian Revolution, or did that party, the Bolsheviks, have to do something totally different in order to be able to lead a revolution? There's been lots of debates on this in the past, and I'm sure we won't solve the issue here today, but I'm very much looking forward to that session. Sounds a very interesting one. So thank you very much, Ian, for preparing this one. Off you go.
Thank you, and good evening, comrades. It was important, I think, to have this discussion around the nature of the party. Not least of which, because there's hardly a week now goes by without there being another party. It's either a mass workers' party, or it's a new communist party, or whatever. The most recent one, of course, is the announcement by Socialist Appeal that they're going to reconstitute themselves as the Revolutionary Communist Party in the spring. And what remains to be seen is just what sort of party that's going to be, and in the same way with new mass workers' party that seem to be spiked. The important thing as well, of course, is that I'm going to argue that the nature of many different groups which have claimed a direct heritage to that of Marx and Engels, and via Lenin, is often a misrepresentation of what even Lenin was talking about. And moreover, the errors that have been made are based upon a particularly narrow reading of Lenin's What is to be Done, published in 1902. So without further ado, we're going to look at a little bit about the German Social Democratic Party. I won't dwell upon it because, after all, we've talked about the SPD quite a lot. But nevertheless, it's important just to mention a few things. This is, you probably see the cursor, this is, there's Wilhelm Liebknecht there, and his August Bebel here. These were some of the SPD members of the Reichstag in 1889. And it's very difficult to overestimate the importance of the German Social Democratic Party, not only within Germany, but to Lenin. Karl Kautsky, sometimes referred to as the Pope of Marxism, had enormous prestige within the context of the German SPD, but also to Lenin too. And as we'll go on to see, much of what Lenin was writing in particular in What is to be Done, was with reference to both Kautsky and, of course, Edward Bernstein. Edward Bernstein, you'll recall, is the sort of leader of the revisionist sect within the German Social Democratic Party, and who was arguing that the end is nothing and the movement is everything. The idea that the aim of the German Social Democrats should be to win gains for the workers, and ultimately socialism will just come into being, and actually whether it comes into being or not at some millennial time in the future is less important than the gains that are made for workers along the way. much of what Lenin was arguing with was really that division within the German Social Democrats. And if we look at the whole series of our discussions on the nature of the party, we've seen in most of the big socialist parties of Europe, there being a distinction to be drawn between the possibilists, for example, in France, against the Guidists in the Parti ouvrier among the French socialists. So wherever we look within the old Second International, we see these kinds of divisions between an explicitly revolutionary and Marxist current and a arguably opportunist reformist current, which owes very little to Marx. The fact that the SPD members of the Reichstag were elected by a general electorate rather than obviously they were selected as candidates by the SPD, but the fact that they were elected by a general electorate potentially has a kind of has the potential for a contradiction between what the parliamentary party does and what the party as a whole wants to happen, something that we'll all be intensely familiar with in the context of the British Labour Party. It's always worth remembering as well that, of course, the German Social Democrats were illegal themselves between 1879 and 1890. But by 1900, and certainly by 1910, the German Social Democratic Party were not only a huge mass party with the explicit aim of bringing about socialism, but they were also a huge part of the kind of day-to-day lives of ordinary workers. People would, if they weren't members of the German Social Democrats themselves, they would be members of clubs that were affiliated with the Social Democrats and so on. So that's the context. And the important thing about this as well, of course, this is a democratic party. It doesn't, there is a tendency now to think of what the Bolsheviks was a party of a new type, a party of highly professional, dedicated revolutionaries that were somewhat distanced from the working class. And what we're going to look at here is how that arose and under what conditions. I'm drawing here in part on a number of sources, but something I found very useful while preparing for this session was a nice little essay by Hal Draper, which is available on the Marx Engels Internet Archive. And I recommend it. It's a nice, easy, short read, but it sums things up very nicely. The myth of Lenin's concept of the party, or what they did to what is to be done, by Hal Draper, which was published in 1990. I'm also drawing, incidentally, upon Marcel Liebman's book, Leninism under Lenin. Just a reminder then of Iskra, the Spark. This was founded in 1900. And you'll recall the week before last when we were talking about the pardon me, the Russian Marxists, many of whom ended up in exile in Geneva, and the editorial board in Geneva. I only found out whilst preparing for this that Lenin's younger brother, Dmitry Ilyich Ulyanov, was also a member of the editorial board. He had an interesting life of his own, trained as a doctor, but was a lifelong revolutionary. So people that I've already introduced, as I say, 2 weeks ago, Vera Zasulich, Pavel Axelrod, Julius Martov, Plekhanov, and so on. It's worth looking at the picture of Iskra as a newspaper. It's lacking a bit in layout, isn't it? I would have thought. Who was it written for? In all probability, it wasn't really written for the average steel worker or coal miner. In fact, it absolutely wasn't. Iskra would have been written largely for consumption by what we might loosely call the intelligentsia. And the whole question about how revolutionary consciousness comes to the working class is at the heart of the whole debate around the development of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. So, here is a newspaper which is largely devoted to theoretical tracts, debates. If you look at the articles, they're often targeting the people of the Narodnik tradition, which I mentioned a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at the Russian Marxists, in particular Narodnaya Volya, with the People's Will group, which were a kind of anarchist terrorist group. And so themes crop up then in what is to be done that were being developed in the editorial board of Iskra. And as we pointed out when looking at the Russian Marxists, if you look here at the list of names of the editorial board, Vladimir Ilyich, of course, and Dmitry Ilyich ended up on the Bolshevik side, but most of the others ended up as Mensheviks. But there again, the tendency is to think of Bolshevism and Menshevism as somehow precise analogues of the possibilists and Guidists in the context of France, or Bernstein and Kautsky in the context of the German SPD. Whilst there are parallels to be drawn, it isn't quite as simple as that. Let's have a little look then again at the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, founded as really, we tend to think of a party as being almost kind of monolithic, and the tendency for people who are brought up on what is to be done as a kind of manual for how to organize a political party, I've tended to emphasize the idea of it sort of being a monolithic kind of organization with a central line and so on. But in fact, it couldn't be further from the truth. Firstly, the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party came into being as the fusion of a number of different groups, as we've mentioned before, the Emancipation of Labour Group, the Union of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, the Jewish Workers' Bund, and others. So there were a whole range of different currents that came together to form the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, and each brought with them their own particular emphasis. The first Congress in 1898 kind of rose without trace, in a sense. Whilst it formally established the party and formally brought these groups together, not a great deal happened. We're looking at an organization which was diffuse. There were small cells in different places, geographically and politically, and that they worked together in a single party was almost more by good luck than management. So we tend to think of the Second Congress, where the split happened between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, largely around the question of Iskra, as being somehow a definitive fracture, that the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks virtually constituted two different parties, and that Lenin went on to lead the kind of victorious group of professional revolutionaries, and that's the type of party we have to have. But again, it really is some way removed from the truth. Going back to Iskra, and suggesting that it was really aimed at the intelligentsia, people would have had to have had some education in order to read it. The average worker, there were very high rates of illiteracy among both the proletariat and the peasantry. So the idea that it clearly wasn't aimed at the vast majority of ordinary workers. But nevertheless, there was a relationship between the intelligentsia and the working class and the peasantry, to which Lenin addresses himself in What Is to Be Done. Written in 1902, Что делать, What Is to Be Done, the name taken from Chernyshevsky's novel, which had been hugely influential as well. If you read through the book, and it was interesting for me rereading it because I found it a lot easier this time round, having been doing the work on some of the other parties in Europe. Because, of course, Lenin is actually addressing himself directly to a range of different European parties. He mentions unfavorably the British Labour Party. He mentions obviously the German Social Democratic Party, and in particular disapprovingly of Bernstein and the tendency to revisionism, which he's talking of in terms of opportunism, the idea of a political organization which, in a sense, owes more to advancing the interests of professional politicians than it does in terms of advancing the interests of the working class. In What is to be done, Lenin is addressing himself often to newspapers such as, and it's the only thing that makes it difficult to read is if it is understanding the nature of the people he's debating with in newspapers such as Рабочее дело, the workers' cause. Рабочее дело was a paper of the Union of Social Democrats Abroad, and was aimed at the political exile community of Russians. And similarly, Рабочая мысль, the workers' thought, was again addressed to people who were largely concerned with what one might call legal Marxism. Remember, Plekhanov had been quite successful at publishing Marxist articles and books popularizing Marxism quite legally at a time when the Russian state, in particular the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, were more concerned with the Narodniks and terrorist organizations rather than Marxism. And Marxism was kind of, in a sense, slipped under the radar as a kind of interesting philosophical discussion. So there was a kind of a tendency towards trying to preserve a sort of legal Marxism. Clearly, though, that's very far removed from what Lenin is arguing. Now, the question is, was Lenin trying to create a new kind of party? What's argued by Hal Draper and others is that, well, no, really what Lenin was doing was saying, let's look towards the example of the German Social Democrats. That's the ideal form of Marxist party to bring about socialism. However, in the context of Russia, an autocracy, and under conditions of illegality, a different type of party organization has to be arrived at. And that's the point. For Lenin, he's not laying down a blueprint for the type of party that Marxists should organize in under all and every circumstance. He's putting forward a blueprint for not having a blueprint. If anything, what he's saying is that in an ideal situation, you really need a party like the German Social Democrats, with an open democratic discussion about the way to achieve socialism. Lenin, naturally has a complete disagreement, as does Kautsky, with Bernstein and the idea that somehow, actually, we don't really need to worry ourselves too much about socialism. We just have to gain small economic reforms and so on for the workers. And that runs throughout what is to be done. What we've seen subsequently is that, and that's why Hal Draper uses the subtitle, What They Did to What Is to Be Done, because what he focuses on is the way in which what he calls Leninologists, as it were, have used what is to be done as a kind of example of the professional Russian revolutionary, and how this inevitably led to totalitarianism in the context of the USSR. Many of the people who have read what is to be done from a hostile perspective, or often within professional Soviet studies type departments, have tried to argue that the roots of Stalinism lay here in Lenin's work, What is to be Done. To make it clear, though, if you as you read through What Is to Be Done, he's having particular debates with particular groups about their stance, for example, on trade unionism. And he draws a distinction between, I mean, it often goes under the term of economism, so relating to the trade unions, but trade unions of a particular type, of a bourgeois type, and a bourgeois type that we're all too familiar with in the context of Britain and the British Labour Party. So from that point of view, he's saying, it's not enough, as the people writing for Рабочее дело are putting forward, to argue for a bourgeois type of trade unionism. It's not enough just to argue for reforms here and there. Yes, we're in favour of reforms, and the more the better, but they have to be both economic, political, and let's not forget the importance of theoretical tasks in the context of a revolutionary party. Bearing in mind, Russia at this time, the industrial proletariat is a tiny proportion of the overall workforce. The majority of the labouring masses of the Russian Empire are peasants. In the context of a growing middle class, there are probably around 20,000 students, and to a certain extent, or to a large extent, most of those students tend to be left-wing, or at least opposed to the autocracy, at the very least. So what about this question about professional revolutionaries? The question has been raised by a number of writers on What Is to Be Done. People who've commentated upon it, about some of the terms used. One is the Russian term professionalny, and the idea of whether this means professional revolutionaries. As has been pointed out, professionalny in this context doesn't mean professional as we would understand it in the context of English. It doesn't mean such as doctors or lawyers and that kind of thing. It really just means skilled as opposed to amateur or haphazard. The idea of and it doesn't necessarily mean just members of the intelligentsia. When Lenin's writing What Is to Be Done, his reference to the intelligentsia is actually a reference in support of Karl Kautsky in German SPD, because Kautsky himself tried to address the question about what's the relationship between an educated intelligentsia and the broader masses of the working class. From Lenin's point of view, the idea of professional revolutionaries, skilled revolutionaries, doesn't mean that they have to be members of the intelligentsia, people with university degrees. It means they have to be professional in the sense of the aim of bringing about socialism becomes an important part of their lives, perhaps a central theme of their lives, but it doesn't mean that workers are excluded from being those professional revolutionaries. In fact, one of the things that's interesting is that there were a higher proportion of the intelligentsia among the Mensheviks and among the SRs than there was among the Bolsheviks. Lenin repeatedly in later works and throughout the collected works of Lenin encouraged the development of trained, skilled revolutionaries within the working class itself. And so, as we'll see, the role of spontaneity is also something that's questioned by Lenin in What Is to Be Done. And the typical caricature is that Lenin was opposed to the idea of spontaneity as something which had a revolutionary potential. In fact, what Lenin's arguing is that spontaneity in terms of revolutionary upheaval will take place, but without some sort of guidance, without some sort of theoretical understanding of the position, without some sort of political direction provided by revolutionaries. The fact is that spontaneity can be dissipated fairly easily, or incorporated, or undermined very quickly by state agents. And this is the whole point. What is to be done is not being put forward as a blueprint for a new type of party applicable under all and every circumstance. It's a type of party which is applicable under the conditions of autocracy, under conditions where the Okhrana will, in all probability, arrest you at some point in your revolutionary career, and you have to be organized accordingly. It's an argument against the kind of economism that's being put forward by Rабочая мысль and newspapers like it. And then the question about democratic centralism. Remember, at the first Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, there really wasn't any kind of central organization. So Lenin in What Is to Be Done is often kind of caricatured as being putting forward the idea that this has to be rigorously centralized, a kind of super centralism. In fact, all he's saying is that there needs to be some kind of central organization, and that instead of having loose circles, for example, of students who are organizing socialist study groups and that kind of thing, something which had been a feature of Narodnaya Volya and other groups before the social democratic tradition. The problem with those is that they all very quickly ended up in Siberia, or in the Shusselbo Fortress, or the Peter and Paul Fortress. They were routinely arrested. So what he's arguing for is a cellular structure which would have some kind of relationship to a center, but obviously a cellular structure means that if the cell is arrested, it doesn't break the entire party. So the centralism that's being referred to here is really just to have some kind of central organization. It isn't, and it's usually just caricatured as being one which is only the leadership of a small self-appointed sect. So Lenin is emphasizing what Engels had emphasized before: the importance of having both having economic, political, and a theoretical task as part of the party. There is another important aspect of the party being put forward by Lenin, is that it changed enormously over time. As Hal Draper argues, the period that is really covered by What Is to Be Done really just amounts to it's really an early work from the point of view of how the party is organized. By 1917, the Bolsheviks have over 350,000 members. It's a mass party by then. There is no relationship between the party that's advocated in What Is to Be Done and the party as it subsequently developed. Also, another feature of the tendency to think of there being Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, and Bolsheviks good, Mensheviks bad, is that it fails to understand that whilst there was a division among the leadership of the party, the Social Democrats continued to work together on the ground throughout, right up until 1917. The split really didn't affect much of the grassroots operation. There's another aspect to it. Lenin is often caricatured as being anti-democratic. In fact, up until 1921, there was a great deal of debate within the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. Lenin didn't always get his own way. Lenin was often outvoted. Lenin certainly didn't use his position to steamroller something through or browbeat his way into authority. And instead, there was a good deal of debate, for example, whether to continue to support the prosecution of Russia's involvement in the Great War. There was an enormous amount of debate between different members of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, both Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. And after all, whether they were Bolsheviks or Mensheviks, they still attracted the attention of the Okhrana. The Okhrana didn't really differentiate between which bits of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party they were addressing. So the frequency with which people were sent off to Siberia meant that the idea of some sort of self-perpetuating elite running the party was actually practically impossible anyway. I remember reading, I couldn't find it, but I was trying to find out where I read it. But about when Lenin is talking about the way in which the party is organized, and talks about throwing the doors open to anyone who wanted to join, could join the Bolsheviks. But that was very much in the period when, in between the February Revolution and the October Revolution, when the likelihood was that anyone who joined the Bolsheviks was going to end up arrested. But notwithstanding that, it still became a mass party. The point is that, as Marcel Liebman points out in Leninism Under Lenin, a superb book on this question, the nature of the party throughout the whole period, the whole Russian revolutionary period, changed constantly depending upon the circumstances. As a consequence of the split, and it was a split which Lenin had no intention of bringing about. His publication of What Is to Be Done was not done in any way, shape, or form in an effort to split the party. And if you read volumes 6 and 7 of the collected works, I didn't manage to get through even a fraction of them. But where I've dipped in, it's quite clear that Lenin had no intention of splitting the party, and more importantly, was very upset that it split at all. But one of the interesting things, and I think important things, was the suggestion that unity and the demand for unity played an interesting role here. And in a sense, it became, given that it was the Mensheviks, which Lenin goes on to argue constitutes a opportunist strand within the Russian Social Democratic and Labour Party, an opportunist strand analogous to that of Bernstein in the context of the SPD, that it was given that it was the right that split, the demand for unity is ultimately ends up being a demand to make concessions to the right. And what did distinguish Lenin in a sense was that he refused to do that, refused to make concessions to the right for unity at any cost. And as we saw, as we've seen with the German Social Democratic Party during the German Revolution, 1918, 1919, the demand for unity was one of the means by which people like Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were shouted down and ultimately suppressed. One step forward, 2 steps back was Lenin's defense of his position in 1902 and then 1903. And talks in terms of different methods of struggle and opportunism in the questions of organization. What Lenin is arguing really is that the idea of the mass party, as is put forward by some, constitutes a means by which an opportunist strand can be preserved. So he's talking then of a dialectic really between 2 strands within the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, of revolutionaries and opportunists, implying a relationship between, as it were, the bourgeois revolution, in a sense that the many Russian socialists before 1900 had expected, the idea that there would be a bourgeois democratic revolution rather than a socialist one. But of course, later on, as we know, this position changed with the possibility that the Bolsheviks might actually take power. Trotsky's response to what is to be done and One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, was, of course, Our Political Tasks, published in 1904, in which really Trotsky takes issue with each step of the way in a slender volume, about the difference between the tactical tasks of Russian Social Democrats around organization questions and the accusation of Jacobinism being leveled at Lenin. And similarly, as we'll go and see, Rosa Luxemburg accused Lenin of Jacobinism and indeed Blanquism, the idea that what Lenin was putting forward was the party substituting itself for the class. You'll recall, of course, from the First International, that the liberation of the proletariat is the act of the workers themselves, as Marx argued. By contrast, Trotsky in this pamphlet is arguing that really Lenin is putting forward the assertion that the party is a substitute for the class. Hal Draper argues that really what's going on here is that Lenin, far from arguing that there should be a separation between the party and the class, that really the party has to provide not only an organizational leadership, but a theoretical, tactical, and intellectual leadership, because the idea that the workers, in particular, at the time, in a largely illiterate workforce, could arrive at a Marxist perspective. And actually, Lenin cites examples of homegrown intellectual revolutionaries, such as Proudhon, such as Weitling, and he's simply arguing that exactly the worker intellectuals have to be trained up, as it were, in the school of revolution in order to achieve those tasks. This is not the place to discuss Rosa Luxemburg at any great length, who deserves her own fuller treatment. I just wanted to mention her own disagreement with Lenin, similar to that of Trotsky, arguing about the importance of spontaneity and her tendency to regard the idea of a central committee as inevitably leading to a distance between, if you like, the thinking part of the movement and the workers themselves, and ultimately creating the possibility of a party that would rise up above the class. And of course, this has been the reason why I've mentioned it here. Her original essay was called Organizational Questions of Russian Social Democracy. This is sometimes published as Leninism or Marxism, and there's a particular history to that. And I'm really just trying to draw attention to something here. The appropriation of what is to be done by different groups and its distortion often has no relationship to, for example, Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg, in a sense, had much more in common with Lenin than she did with Bernstein, and even after 1914, Kautsky. Notwithstanding that, she did have a kind of critical perspective. But the idea of Luxemburg putting forward the idea of being only in favor of spontaneity is also a caricature, but it's one that you see, for example, in some of the works by Noam Chomsky, who argues that it was Rosa Luxemburg's position on spontaneity and the importance of the self-action of the working class. And this is of great importance. And so Chomsky comes out on the side of Luxemburg rather than on the side of Lenin. What I'm suggesting here is that the appropriation of Luxemburg in this way is misleading. And Chomsky, when he does this, it has to be seen in the context of Chomsky also arguing in favor of some of the writings of Bakunin, which is difficult to reconcile with any kind of theoretical appreciation of the importance of the theoretical aspects of a political movement. The publication of in English of Leninism or Marxism was attributed to the Scottish Anti-Parliamentary Communist Federation. By this time, of course, the Soviet Union had undergone significant changes, and of course there had been the growth of anti-parliamentary communist groups, and some of these were, of course, in a Scottish context. Willie Gallagher was particularly mentioned by Lenin in Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, as was Sylvia Pankhurst. So the publication of Leninism or Marxism came about in 1935 by the Scottish Anti-Parliamentary Communist Federation. In conclusion, then, all I've tried to argue here is that the party that Lenin was putting forward was not some radically new type of party. It was a party based upon the conditions of operating under illegality, under an autocracy in Russia at the time. And it doesn't mean that caricature of a party, which Lenin himself didn't adhere to beyond about 1907 at all, and never regarded it as a blueprint for the way in which a Marxist party should be, has been seized upon by all and sundry for their own particular ends. And we see it repeated time and time again when we look at very undemocratic left-wing sects that appear to be based around a single guru-type figure, whether it's Tony Cliff or Peter Taft or Ted Grant, or, and the list goes on. So in conclusion, then, I'm just simply trying to argue that Kautsky wasn't always called renegade. He had an important part to play in the development of socialist ideas, but that Lenin broke with Kautsky for very good reasons at a particular time. But nevertheless, his perspectives on the nature of the party were as democratic as the SPD had been, and it was the events of the Russian Revolution itself that led to changes in the way in which the party was organized, particularly after 1921, when factions were banned within the context of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Thank you, comrades.
Wow, excellent. Thank you very much, Ian. That was a really good presentation. And I think you've done a really good job explaining some of the misconceptions about what is to be done, which are a wide variety, as you say, on the left as well on the right. You did mention, things like trade unionism. I mean, people have used this pamphlet to say, oh, Lenin was against trade unionism and stuff. Just, what? Why? It makes no sense. And then you actually look at the passage, and it's, he means, and I would recommend as well that comrades look at this. Lars T. Lee, Lenin Rediscovered. I think it's a mirror image, but it's Lenin Rediscovered by Lars T. Lee. It's a bit big, that book, but it's really interesting because he goes through, like Hal Draper does as well, goes through the various mistranslations perhaps, or, not necessarily mistranslations, but wrong translations, some probably not on purpose, but they do lead to a different understanding. So it was, a bourgeois-led trade unionism. We oppose that as well, of course. There's the question of professionalism, as you say, that people used to understand that as, oh, you have to be an intellectual, the party has to be led by intellectuals, which lots of organizations did then and still do, that you have to have this cadre of people, and they have to come from, they have to be students, etc., intellectuals, when you actually meant skilled. That's a problem with the translation. One you didn't mention, I think it's the Konspiratsia, I can't pronounce it properly, the Russian, which is also how Lars T. Lee explains quite well, which a lot of people on the left, and the right have meant to mean, oh yeah, he's in favor of conspiracy, because that's what Konspiratsia means, and terror, and you have to organize secretly, or as a principle, we have to organize secretly in terror groups, etc. When he meant skilled in illegal work, because we've been made illegal. So we have to learn how to operate in illegal circumstances, etc. So these various books, Leninism under Lenin as well, really good in trying to explain and take away some of the misconceptions then, and the idea that Lenin, straight line, Lenin, Stalinism, there's clearly a line. It's very easy for bourgeois politicians to go that way. A couple of questions to you then before I open the chat. Comrades, if you want to make a contribution or want to make ask a question, there's no wrong questions. Please click raise hand. It's sort of under question. There's in what is to be done. Amongst other things, Lenin, you could say, not only defends Kautsky, he has quite large sections on I'm saying Kautsky, I'm German, Kautsky, he's called Karl Kautsky. As you say, he was actually, turned into the renegade in 1914. But he also talks about what we would now perhaps call economism, i.e. that we shouldn't just sort of you mentioned that in the term of Bernsteinism, you shouldn't just fight just for higher wages or something and hope by itself the working class will pick it up and will fight for socialism, but that the working class needs to fight for all sorts of high political questions. All political questions need to be addressed. Could you talk about this a bit more, the sort of the democratic aspect of his ideas, of his program in that pamphlet and beyond?
Political demands were central to Lenin's project. The idea of, initially, of course, what was intended was to call for a constituent assembly. So the political reforms that would be demanded would be precisely those which would help to organize a Marxist party legally. And wouldn't shy away for one moment from standing for election for the Duma, for example, even though the Duma itself was little more than a consultative body, a bit like, not like the Privy Council, but that kind of thing. The Duma didn't have the power to create legislation without the assent of the Tsar. We talk about the royal assent in the British context, and that's just a formal thing. The king just signs off whatever act it is. But in the context of Russia, if the Tsar didn't want a piece of legislation to happen, it wouldn't happen. So the Duma in itself was quite ineffectual, but it didn't stop the Bolsheviks standing and being successful in getting elected to the Duma. And they didn't do it for the sake of being elected, for the sake of being professional politicians. They used their position in the Duma to demand further reforms, to demand and put forward an argument as tribunes of the working class, if you will. Mensheviks were also successful in getting elected to the Duma, and I think that the whole point about the difference in approach, what Lenin is suggesting is, and subsequent writers, of course, have suggested, the distinction between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks in the context of the Duma was that Mensheviks regarded it rather like people like Bernstein in the context of the Reichstag in Germany. The idea that you should use this to gain a series of gradual reforms, and that would of itself be the point. Lenin is quite clear. The only reason for taking seats in the Duma is to argue for socialism. Mm. So reforms are essential. Political demands as well as economism demands for increased pay or better trade union rights or whatever else are intrinsic to what the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party was doing.
You also talked to me, you mentioned about Iskra and the way it looked. It's you put that forward to somebody today, it'd be like, what? Yeah, that'd be sort of totally out of the question, etc. And you read some of the newspapers of today's left, and you think, like, it's like the Sun, the really short article, don't stretch the working class don't quite get it. So we have to be like really simple. We have to tell them war is bad and, socialism's good, but don't have debates, etc. Don't argue with each other in the paper, etc. Because that's really confusing. How would the working class understand who's right and who's wrong? Lenin didn't have that view, did he?
No, I mean, and nor did anybody else. It was quite interesting, really. I hadn't realised that Rosa Luxemburg's critique of Lenin was published in the same year in both Neue Zeit and in Iskra. But Neue Zeit, despite the fact that Lenin was actually quite gentle in his reply to Rosa Luxemburg, his reply wasn't published in Neue Zeit. So.
Censored there.
But all of them engaged in a vigorous polemical style. Let's put it that way. And the interesting thing is that I hadn't really, although Lenin engages in a vigorous polemical style, he's never nasty about it, and he doesn't, and he quite clearly doesn't hold grudges. Comradely debates, or they might be, quite vigorously prosecuted, don't seem to have stopped him working closely with exactly the same people later on. And of course, the best example is that of Trotsky. Doesn't seem to have stopped him working with Trotsky at all. But I was also fascinated by just how much although there was a split in the party formally, how, because of the conditions of illegality, they carried on working together anyway, certainly at the grassroots level.
And I mean, that does lead to my next question, is the question of factions. I mean, you mentioned in your introduction, and I think it's quite interesting, Socialist Appeal is renaming itself as Revolutionary Communist Party. If you're a communist, that sounds like a really good idea, because the Revolutionary Communist Party, as well as the Bolsheviks, and they want to be in that tradition, were made up of factions, open factions, who argued their ideas, etc. So, if Socialist Appeal means that kind of Revolutionary Communist Party, be fantastic for the left, and all communists should get involved, because there were a lot of factional struggles in Iskra, weren't there?
Absolutely, and I'm placing bets that the new Revolutionary Communist Party won't be tolerating organised factions within its ranks. We'll just have to wait and see, really. It will be interesting, but if I was a betting man,
certainly something happening in society that they feel, this is the time to that's a good idea. You mentioned, just my last question out before I bring in comments from the floor, you mentioned that Lenin, he had his same program. He stuck to his program for, the working class led revolution, which includes the peasantry and takes the leadership out of the hands of the liberal bourgeoisie. So he stuck to that strategy all the way through. But organizationally and tactically, but we're looking at organization now particularly, they were quite flexible in terms of how they organized. And you mentioned that. Could you describe a few different ways of how they're organized?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because who would have heard of the idea of a workers' and peasants' republic? It would have been unthinkable to anyone before it was being coined by Lenin. No one would have the idea of putting forward a workers' and peasants' republic. Lenin arguably had a tendency to use slogans in a way to achieve the best political effect. Now, you can argue that he shouldn't do, or shouldn't have done, that, for example, the right of nations to self-determination was not a particularly Marxist assertion of itself. Of course, Marx and Engels were in favour of dismantling empires, would have supported, for example, Indian independence, would have certainly argued for Irish independence. But the fact that the formulation of a right of nations to self-determination owed more to President Wilson of the United States than it did to the Bolsheviks. the right of nations to self-determination as a kind of abstract right was, of course, something that Rosa Luxemburg took issue with. Because after all, he didn't do it. There was no part of the Russian Empire which was allowed to cede was Finland, and we know what happened there later. So the use of slogans, the use of particular demands. So, for example, I mean, the demand of sort of land to the peasants. To what extent Lenin ever actually intended land to be just simply parceled up to peasants is highly questionable. And why would you? Well, because we had this. Because when we were looking at the Russian Marxists, you'd actually want large-scale agriculture, wouldn't you? You'd want large-scale agriculture that would be productive. So I'm not suggesting that Lenin was just simply using slogans in an opportunistic way, but he used slogans to achieve achieve a political objective.
Mm. And also, I mean, organizationally, the party went through different stages. You had quite a, when you're illegal, you have to have quite a tight organization. You have to trust each other, etc. They had loads of police spies amongst them anyway. But it was quite a tight. And then when things move, boom, you just open up, as you say. Everybody join now, etc. So you go through different phases, etc. I'm gonna bring in Steve Freeman first, because I could see him shaking his head when you were mentioning the right of nations to self-determination, which I'm sure he thinks is a Marxist demand. Yeah. Come on in, Steve.
I wouldn't like to say it's a Marxist demand. I would say it was a democratic demand, which Lenin, and a Republican demand, and the working class and the Bolsheviks were the best fighters for this demand. They're most committed to it. Not Woodrow Wilson, by the way. I don't know what Woodrow Wilson ever did, but whatever it did, he did it with a kind of imperialist self-determination, recarving up the world in the interests of imperialism. Whereas I think Lenin's commitment to self-determination was a genuine aspect of democracy and internationalism. He understood that's fundamentally, if you want to bring people together, don't force them into some dodgy union. Let them be free, and then they will freely come together. So the right of nations was both democratic and internationalist, and a fundamental part of the Bolsheviks' minimum and Republican program. So Lenin was absolutely right on that. Now, I wasn't intending to speak about this, just you have to throw that up, and as Tina said, it made me start shaking my head. Which you shouldn't really do. But anyway, otherwise, Ian, obviously it was an excellent talk, as they have all been. But so I thought I would just pick on a couple of other points, some of which have been said. And I suppose that if we take what is to be done, you've got to separate out some of the specific things that arose because of the autocracy and the illegality, which don't necessarily generally apply anywhere, and other ideas which are more universal in what's being argued. Obviously, if it's illegal, and you're gonna have a cell structure, and you're gonna have a centralized command structure, and tasks are going to be given out, and you're going to have full-time revolutionaries trying to carry out a very small scale organization, as Tina's already made this point, to do that. And what's it going to do, this organization? Well, it's going to deliver propaganda. It's not delivering bombs, it's delivering words. It's engaged in a war of words. And words, don't underestimate words. Words are weapons. And the newspaper, therefore, was a central way of delivering. They were not terrorists. They were trying to raise consciousness with their newspaper, not to the average worker necessarily, but to the advanced workers. So having the debates that Tina already previously mentioned were very important to really get to the way in which the bourgeoisie and the czarists were using words to enslave the working class and deceive the working class. And the Bolshevik polemics were designed to unpick that and to expose the truth, I think was the name of one of their papers, but truth to the working class. That's why they picked that. And then, of course, obviously, to take this war of words into Parliament, to take it into the trade unions, to take it into the communities. And in a sense, the pen was mightier than the sword, really, for them, except that in a certain circumstances, they would also need swords, obviously, not just pens. So I'll just leave that for a minute. I want to say about spontaneity. I mean, spontaneity for me, spontaneity happens. People protest, they go on strike, they organize demos. They're not really unplanned, by the way, because somebody's got to be organizing them anyway. But I mean, you imagine they're all that unplanned. If the party didn't exist in capitalism, people would still go out protesting about stuff because we're living in a class society. So no party, people are still spontaneously going out and doing stuff. What Lenin was saying was Lenin was attacking the idea, he called it the worship of spontaneity. That is to say, making spontaneity into a god or a fetish, meaning that we just follow along what people are doing without any real thought. You know, what's the most important thing to do? The answer is to do what the masses are doing. So if the masses are going on strike, that's the most important thing. And Lenin completely rejected that. The party has to be independent of spontaneity by having its own independent program. And in a sense, the party is a different kind of organization struggling with its own political aim and political objective and political program, regardless of whether people are demonstrating in the street or not. Obviously, you want the party to address the people who are spontaneously struggling and fighting for pay. You don't go in another field somewhere while they're over outside the factory going on strike. Obviously, you want to take the message, but the message you're taking is not that go along to the strike and say, oh, what a great idea to have higher pay. What the Bolsheviks were doing is they were an organization trying to overthrow the Tsar, trying to establish a democratic republic. And that was the meaning of social democracy, hence their minimum program and the right of nations to self-determination all fit together in a republican program. And that was because they were relating to the state of consciousness, the mass consciousness, and what people in Russia wanted. And you're right to say, you know, it's creative, the peasants, you know, the idea of a workers and peasants republic and so on is very, very was central to it, to all of that. This is quite different from what the SWP does. The SWP, for example, we talk about something current, they've never really had a program. They've always worshipped spontaneity, go wherever anything's happening and jump on board that. So that's what they do. They don't have an independent, they're not struggling independently with a program and trying to win people to that program. They just follow it. They're going around to see what's going on and joining in with that. If there's a demo, they will go on it, regardless, really, of what it. I mean, that's a slight caricature of their position, but I think it's important. All these things, worship of spontaneity, tailism, by the way, that's what they're doing. Worship of spontaneity means you tail, you follow, you don't lead, you're not the vanguard, you follow what the masses are doing and just go along behind it and join in with it. And that again goes, and I'll finish on this point, Tina, because other comments will come in, but I'll just finish on this point. And tailism is connected to economism, because economism means that you have a very limited trade unionist kind of program. It's that limitation. And therefore you start to think that the party is just a kind of bigger trade union. And it's not. It's a political organization engaged in a very different a kind of struggle to what trade unions are engaged in, even though they've got to connect up in some way, and that's the party has to connect up in them. So I'll finish at that point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ian, do you want to respond to anything?
I've no substantial disagreements with you, Steve. But when we come back to this question about the right of nations to self-determination, I'm not arguing, for example, we'd be in favour of if Wales decided to secede from the United Kingdom or Scotland or whatever, that we'd somehow oppose it. But I would argue, for example, I'm more interested in a socialist United States of Europe than I am in an independent Scotland or England or whatever. So I think the national question is vitally important. What I'm saying is that Luxemburg criticised Lenin, so pointing out that Woodrow Wilson was also talking about the right of nations to self-determination. But of course, as you say, quite rightly, he was doing so in the context of dismembering the empires of Europe, such as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in favour of the interests of the United States, which was constituting itself as an empire. And from that point, and the other point, as I say, simply was that Lenin didn't do it. Arguably, Georgia would have been independent. Georgia wasn't allowed to secede. The Ukraine would have been independent, or wasn't allowed to secede. But of course, one has to look at the balance of forces going on there at the time. An independent Ukraine would have been a disaster for the new Soviet Republic. Moreover, there was a revolutionary movement in Ukraine. So, from the point of view of the Red Army, of course, you would support the revolutionaries in Ukraine rather than the bourgeois Republicans who wanted an independent capitalist Ukraine. And from that point of view, one can see that there's a relationship between Lenin's slogans and what he did. But the idea of putting forward an abstract right of self-determination and then saying, well, that just applies to everywhere, when clearly he didn't do it. And similarly, when things like slogans around peace, of course, Lenin wanted to see the end of the war. He didn't want to see people getting slaughtered. But it also appealed enormously to a very tired soldiery, which was overwhelmingly peasant. The overwhelming majority were recruits from the peasantry. So Lenin's, I'm not suggesting, as I say, that he was necessarily... I don't think even he would have agreed that ultimately you're looking at a workers' and peasants' republic. I think he was wanting to win in the belief that ultimately the victory of the Russian Revolution would mean a victory of world revolution, because they would be joined by the German Revolution, the French Revolution, and so on.
Thank you. I always thought the demand for a right of nations to self-determination was a way to stop secession. It was a way to offer, for example, the working class in Scotland. We give you the right to secede, but we ask you not to do it. So you have, by giving, by fighting for your right to go away if you wanted to, we're hoping you'll stay, which seems quite a good tactic to, a democratic answer to what is often a real question in many areas. But okay, Raymond, please.
Yeah, just on that point, the so-called right to self-determination really has to be weighed against the material benefits for the working class, given separation. And the majority in Scotland decided no, the material benefits weren't there, so we're staying within Great Britain. And as an activist for over 50 years, for the shop floor, shop steward, branch secretary, trades council chairperson, and all the rest of it, I've always been interested in what were the links, the pre-revolutionary links between the Bolsheviks and the organised trade union movement of Russia at the time. And nobody has been able to tell me exactly what the situation was. I mean, did the Bolsheviks work alongside the trade unions, or did they only work in parallel with them? Were the Bolsheviks members of trade unions? Were they elected shop floor representatives? Were they elected within the trade union and the branch structures? Did they represent their workmates in that fashion? Did they negotiate with employers? Did they put forward the demands for a new type of society together with demands for improvements in hours and conditions? And nobody's been able to answer those questions. And I'm hoping maybe Ian or some others within your audience have got those answers, because given the parlous state of the British trade union labour movement at the present time, we need to draw on lessons from the past, and the lessons have to be positive. They have to be gains. They've got to be victories. We don't want to be continually looking back in history and running over the ruins with disappointments and defeats and all the rest of it. And one of the things that really annoys me about the British trade union labour movement, we seem to sanctify glorious losses. Is that because we've not got any glorious victories to celebrate? And that one really does mean nothing. I'm not kidding you. So were there any links, pre-revolutionary links, between the organised political working class organisations and the organised trade union working class?
Thanks, Raymond. Ian,
Well, certainly both wings of the Russian Social Democratic Party worked within unions to influence them. But the other thing, of course, that happened was the Soviets. And really, when you think about all these debates that were taking place around what is to be done and within the party, in a sense, what happened in 1905 changed everything. And the coming into being of the Soviets themselves posed the real possibility of workers taking power for themselves. At the time, in a sense, the coming into being of the Soviets was a spontaneous act. It posed again this question about the relationship between spontaneity and organization. Trotsky, to his credit, of course, was there and led the Petrograd Soviet. And his book 1905 is one of the most magnificent things he's ever written. In terms of the kind of formal relationships, the extent to which, for example, Bolsheviks or Mensheviks took office within trade unions, I really don't know enough about them, whether they were working on the shop floor. But they were certainly agitating. And it's an interesting distinction, perhaps, to draw between propaganda. I mean, we tend to think of propaganda today as being an epithet, really. We talk about propaganda as meaning somehow spinning a web of lies. But the meaning then was about having a kind of an appreciation of the situation, being able to write, for example, for a paper and being able to disseminate leaflets and the rest of it, to influence workers, not just in day-to-day industrial action for higher pay or whatever else, but also in terms of advancing the interests of the class. And a distinction drawn between propagandists and agitators. And clearly, there was a place within the Russian Social Democratic Party for workers of all levels, irrespective of whether they were educated or not, irrespective of their relationship to whether they were holding official positions within trade unions or not. In terms of the specifics, I don't know the details about who headed up the leadership of individual trade unions in the context of the Soviet Union. But it'd be an interesting thing for me to go and find out about. Thank you. I don't know if anybody else out there knows.
If you do, raise your hand, please, and I'll bring you in. Thanks, Raymond. Matthew.
Yeah, my comrades. I think the thing is, think about the whole basis of the RS, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, and the Bolsheviks, of course, is how much it changes. I think there's two things that really come out of it. One is how difficult it was to operate in underground under conditions in which people were forever being arrested, to actually operate the thing. The fact that Lenin actually built this enormous, great big underground operation just to get the newspaper into the country, which went all the way through the Arctic Circle and so on, involved all these people moving his papers into the country. The fact that as I say, people were, I think that the average life of an activist was about 6 months before they got arrested. The fact that, of course, these organizations were also, of course, riddled with police agents, as was discovered after 1917. They're actually stuffed with police agents, as you would expect, up to and including, Lenin's head of the Duma, Malinovsky, the head of the delegation of the Duma, who was found to be an Ukrainian agent. So it's extremely different. I mean, it simply isn't a model that you could use under conditions of legality, and in a society, in the kind of society we're operating at the moment. I think the thing is also is it changes because obviously it goes through like a series of phases. I mean, first of all, obviously the effort to set the thing up. The first Congress is in 1899, 1898 in Russia, and is effectively basically says we've established a party and is then dispersed under pressure. Then the second Congress is held in again under pressure from assorted sources in London and then in Brussels once once things got too hot. So it's that sort of position. Then of course 1905 is completely different, and actually Lenin has to sort of invert a lot of the things he said previously, about organization, and say, okay, well now we have to open up. Now we have to go and talk openly, and there was a great deal of suspicion in the Bolshevik, certainly the Bolshevik wing, about the Soviets, and it was actually Trotsky who said, well, these things are this is really where it's coming from, and it was Trotsky that got in first in those terms and became the leader of effectively the political leadership of the Petrograd Soviet, or St. Petersburg Soviet at the time. But the thing being, that it changed the whole nature of the organization, and then of course you get the clamps back down again, and then of course you lose a whole lot of people. You've gained a new generation, you gained a whole new generation of people, many of them teenagers and so on, young workers and intellectuals. Under conditions in which virtually the entire youth intelligentsia is against the regime, and large sections of working class, you hate the regime anyway, so you recruit all these people. Then of course as the pressure clamps down, you lose a whole chunk of them, and obviously you're dealing at the same time in a condition in which large numbers of people you're actually dealing with are all in exile, including all the main leadership. It's a completely different form of organization. And then of course you in 1917, and so you at the same time, of course, actually the split between Bolshevik and Menshevik is not actually carried out. That's also, there are still branches meeting together in 1917. It doesn't work its way through in those terms. So it's really quite different. And then there's this, the question, well, okay, what's the the political things that come out, the fact all of this change. The core, of course, really, the important thing is 1905, as you say, is absolutely central. It is the dress rehearsal for 1917. Without 1905, there's no 1917. There's no question of it. Because it actually takes people through the whole process of a revolution. Okay, an unsuccessful revolution, but a revolution in which the dictators are, there isn't an effort by the regime to exterminate the people who've been through, who've led these things. People get through, in terms of the movement of the masses and so on, how these things work and the rest of it, and then able to apply those lessons in 1917. How it all functions, and nobody else. You can quite clearly see the difference between that and everybody else trying to run revolutions in the wake of the First World War, and they don't have that experience, and it's very obvious they don't have that experience. So in those terms, it's really quite different. And I think that in terms of the model that you're looking at, the problem is to try and understand what. As you say, when Lenin's writing all this stuff, what's the conditions he's writing it under? What actually happened? And are there any lessons that you can apply to today, or are you looking at today a completely different set of conditions, and therefore you can apply certain lessons, but you cannot directly apply organizational forms. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Carol, please.
Yes, I get the impression, Ian, from your talk that the people like Lenin and Trotsky and so on, and Kautsky, and they seem to think that the working class itself couldn't, was a bit hamstrung in terms of not being literate, etc., and therefore they needed leadership and they needed education and so on. Now, that's what Christabel Pankhurst thought about the working class women in the East End of London, but it wasn't true, because when they had the matched women's strike, it wasn't Annie Besant that led that; it was the women themselves that did that. So, do you think that they were underestimating the working class then, and do you think that we're perhaps a bit guilty of that today, thinking that the ordinary person the ordinary trade union member or whatever, that they need guidance, they need education. And in actual fact, they're much more capable than we think they are.
Thank you, Carol. Sorry, I didn't actually let you come in after Matthew spoke. So if you want to reply to both of them now, please.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think I know enough of one another. So of course, I agree with everything you said. I'm just practicing my tubercular cough in solidarity with the revolutionary workers of the past. The accusation that the Bolsheviks didn't trust the workers and that they had to have leadership or else they could achieve nothing, it is exactly one of the caricatures that was leveled at Lenin. Lenin was at pains to try and get as many workers involved in leadership and in education as humanly possible. To a much greater extent, for example, than the SRs, who are often thought of as being a very populist organization and a much bigger party after all, but as I say, had a huge proportion of intelligentsia in their leadership, more so than the Bolsheviks. I think, though, it is an important question if you think about what's been happening just this year. None of the strikes that we saw raised any demands, as far as I'm aware, of anything other than fair pay or more pay. And from that point of view, someone needs to say, we haven't even gone beyond what Marx was arguing in the First International, that the aim should be the abolition of wage labour, not just a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. And so to give a political direction and to have an education programme, I think, is vitally important. And of course, at the same time, anyone who's in that position or anyone who's trying to put that forward immediately gets accused of just engaging in, abstract academic debate for its own sake. I think, though, that the point is to not make fools of ourselves. If you can know in advance that something is going to happen because you've studied the situation, because you know the circumstances under which a struggle is taking place. I mean, I don't know what would be a good example. I mean, one of my early formative experiences was the 1982 health workers dispute, and there you constantly got trade unions talking about the nurses' pay dispute in the belief that somehow that would lead to public sympathy and that would win the pay award. Well, all that happened is it meant that the Royal College of Nursing and the Royal College of Midwives accepted their own pay award and undermined the entire dispute. In so doing, not only did it fail in its economistic demands for more money, but it failed politically in all sorts of ways. So it set the scene, for example, for widespread privatisation within the NHS. It set the scene for an accelerated closure of the psychiatric hospitals and the privatisation of the care of the elderly mentally ill, most of whom with dementia. So relationships between rank and file workers who are activists within their unions and a politicized and educated leadership, I would argue, is vitally important. Because otherwise, what we're going to end up with? What do we want? More pay? When do we want it? Now? Oh, all right, we haven't got it, so we'll just go back to being defeated then. And isn't that what we've seen? Isn't that what we've seen with the junior doctors, with the RMT union has effectively accepted a pretty poor, was it 5% or something? And promise of, how much was it?
Less, 4 point something.
Less than 5% and jam tomorrow. And now we're seeing ASLEF coming forward with industrial action. But again, in what political context? So I take your point about spontaneous action, and I've seen it with my own eyes, where you'll get the trade union leadership, for example, is taken completely by surprise by some spontaneous action. But that says a lot about the trade union leadership and the very nature of it, and I think it's why there needs to be a fully politicized class. Something I perhaps haven't mentioned, and should have done, is the idea of the working class isn't just a bunch of workers. The working class, in order to be a class, has to act as a collectivity. It's almost as if, well, it is. Unless it's a collectivity, it's not a class at all. It's only a nascent class. So just a bunch of workers, whether it's the entire working population of Britain, or whether it's NHS people, or whether it's train drivers or whatever, just a group of workers doesn't make of itself a class. It's a class in status nascendi, as it were. It's a nascent class, and it's only under particular circumstances it comes to into being as a class for itself, recognizing its historical role. And it's at that point that the political leadership becomes crucial. Just a group of workers together ends up being defeated, atomized, and each successive defeat just becomes another, glorious defeat, whether it's the miners' strike, or whether it's a health workers' dispute, or whether it's junior doctors, or whatever. Until they get to a point where there is a class that actually recognizes its power, acts as a collectivity, and with an overall objective of the transformation of society, then that class isn't even coming into being. So I think that's the most important aspect about the leadership in terms of and the importance of a party. And you can have a debate about what the nature of the party is, the organizational form that it takes. But the party of the working class, when you look at the Communist Manifesto, it's the working class itself that will transform society. But at the same time, that leadership is crucially important.
Thank you. Did you want to say anything about what Matthew was talking?
No, I agree. I mean, perhaps there's other things that I could have mentioned that didn't. We tend to think in terms of, male workers bashing metal and that kind of stuff. But of course, there was other aspects to the whole organization. People like Alexandra Kollontai and the importance within the Russian Social Democratic Party, and, for example, the question around women. And again, it was a flourishing of political ideas at a revolutionary time. It's almost as if when you get to a revolutionary moment, almost everything is up for grabs. Everything can be questioned, whether it's gender relations, whether it's sexuality, whether it's the understanding of history, the whole mental health, physical health, all sorts of everything comes. And it's seizing the moment. It's seizing the moment of the flood, which is what a party is there for, and can make the difference to whether it goes further or just gets dissipated. I think the problem. I mean, we see it today with worldwide demonstrations of millions of people in support of the people of Palestine. Whether that just now dissipates itself and becomes a series of people who, like after the vast demonstrations against the Iraq war, just think, well, we didn't win that one. We said what we thought, and they didn't take any notice. Well, clearly, it's got to go further than that, and that's the problem. If it's just spontaneity, if it's just the street, if it's just the occasional wildcat strike, then it's easily dissipated and easily beaten. and I think there needs to be something else that can sustain it through the low periods, but also learn the lessons of that. I'm not sure we've learned the lessons of the Great March against the Iraq War. And my fear is that the people of Palestine will continue to be butchered. And unless something happens beyond the street, we will see the limits of spontaneity.
Absolutely. John's got his hand up, but I think he doesn't want his camera on, or his camera doesn't work. So you can speak now, John. John Fitzgerald, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Thanks. Yeah, very interesting discussion. I sort of, you hear many different interpretations of all these kind of issues and the history of it, so on. I suppose I'm kind of interested in, because what Ian was just saying, that to have the, to have the importance of the party itself. I believe that I've kind of heard a lot about the fact that you need objective and subjective conditions for certain, the things to actually take place, begin or whatever. And we seem to be living in a time where, as Ian says, everything is spontaneity in a way, and contained in all kinds of ways, even by our own, trade unions. So there seems to be more a case of having some kind of objective, and conditions and subjective conditions or whatever. The other thing is, I wondered why the actual factions in the party, the Russian party, came to an end in 21. And there's also been a lot of, well, again, there's so much said that you just don't know what to believe half the time. But in the I haven't done a great deal of reading around these issues. I'm a bit ignorant, unfortunately. I'm trying to learn. The fact that the Soviets at their congresses before the actual between February and October, their congresses, Soviets would come, delegations would come, Soviets all over Russia, and I've heard that Lenin didn't really win too many of the arguments. He didn't win over the actual, delegated Soviets, and that him and well, they call it a coup, don't they? That they went ahead with this, and it never worked out. So yeah, that's it really. I'm sorry if I've been a bit all over the place.
No, that's all right. Thank you, John.
Not at all. I thought they're excellent questions. So objective and subjective, certainly. I mean, one of the ironic things about the present is that objectively we're in a far better position than the Bolsheviks ever were. Not only is the worldwide proletariat bigger than it's ever been, the proletariat, at the time of the Russian Empire, it had only just come out of feudalism. Much of the world was hardly, well, it was touched by capitalism, often in the most brutal and awful way, but hadn't been as fully incorporated into capitalism as it is today. So the objective conditions are actually far better than they were for the Bolsheviks. But of course, the subjective conditions are very, very different indeed. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. One of which, and perhaps one of the most important ones, was the defeat of the Russian Revolution. Not only was it defeated, but it was defeated in such a way as that for a lot of people, that socialism is associated with the most brutal barbarism imaginable. There was a time, of course, when there would be blood and snot all over the carpet if you had discussions with anybody who was on the left about the nature of the Soviet Union, what it was and what it wasn't, and so on. I think it's an advance to think that that's now somewhat decided. It's gone, it's done, and what we now have to argue for. But I think it's still there. It still reverberates, and it still reverberates. So, for example, with the foundation of the Revolutionary Communist Party, as it will go ahead in the spring. So, with regard to the ending of factions in 1921, was about this question of defeat. Because once the German Revolution had been defeated, and it didn't look as if revolution would take off in Britain. There's a whole question about whether the Easter uprising in Dublin, had it happened a year later, might have had a completely different effect. But of course, 1921 also coincides with what? Kronstadt, the uprising of the sailors at Kronstadt. And what were they demanding? They were demanding, we want the Soviets to have power back again, because the Soviets had lost power. And in a sense, a lot of the debate around what is to be done, when you look at people like Noam Chomsky and so on, will say it's this emphasis upon the party and the central control of the Central Committee, as it were, that leads to an authoritarian society. I think another way of looking at it is that had the revolution not been defeated, and it was defeated in Russia in the sense that once it couldn't break out, once the German Revolution had been defeated, once the Bienno Rosso, or the 2 red years in northern Italy, had been defeated, where was it going to go? Now, was it either going to just, and of course Trotsky argues it could either has to be another revolution, or it will simply revert to capitalism. Where was the other revolution going to come from? By 1921, you've also had, was it 21 or 22, the Treaty of Rapallo, where the Soviet Union is basically saying, we just need to survive. So however vile it is, we'll enter into a treaty with Weimar Germany, the people who had killed Rosa Luxemburg, the people who'd killed Karl Liebknecht, because we need German goods. We need to be able to sell corn and so on. So it was defeat, and it was defeat that the closing down of factions was a recognition that in a situation of defeat you can't really tolerate dissent. Had there been victory, it would have been different altogether. And perhaps had Lenin survived, he might have eventually recognized that the closing down factions and suppressing the SRs and the Mensheviks and so on had actually been self-defeating. There is an argument which says, well, maybe they should have just gone down as a good example, like the Paris Commune, but what if history is fraught with problems? What would you have done at the time? You'd want to keep your powder dry. You'd want to just cling on as long as you could, even though Kronstadt was an abomination, even though the Treaty of Rapallo was an abomination at the time, but continued to be honoured even when Hitler had taken power. Yes. So the Soviets themselves had ceased to function really from about 1920 as independent expressions of working class power, as indeed had the trade unions. How does all this relate to the present? Our objective conditions are such that that socialism is rotten ripe, really, and look at what's happening subjectively. That's also very different to back then. There are now demonstrations worldwide that can recognise what imperialism has done in Palestine and what it's doing on a day-to-day basis. And the subjective understanding of what's happening in the Middle East has been completely transformed in a matter of weeks. When things happen, they happen fast. And so my only hope is that there's enough of a party, there's enough of an informed group of people who can, make it more than just something which will go down as another historic defeat.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Ian. And I think the lessons from this sub-series, and we've summed them up, you've just summed them up earlier in the session as well, is, we need to be fighting for socialism clearly, spelling out what socialism is, do so democratically, do it allowing factions. I think you quite rightly said that was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, and an understanding that they couldn't hold out. So the banning of the factions, crunch, that were, a reflection of the, sorry, I've got a little puppy on my, that was the beginning of the end of the Russian Revolution, unfortunately. Factions need to be able to organize democracy. You have to have debate. You have to allow differences. Otherwise, you are becoming a little terror state within the state. If you don't allow differences and you outlaw them, etc., and ban them. So that was very useful summing up today. Thank you very much, Ian. This was the last session in our sub-series, Marx and Party Building, and very excited that next week we're starting a new sub-series called The History of Palestine-Israel. We're looking at a number of questions on the ban on pet factions. Yeah, I got here, this is Ruby, she's growling away. I'm trying to keep her quiet, sorry, comrades. So we're looking at various aspects. What is Hamas? Where does it come from? The role of British imperialism in the Middle East from the 19th, 20th century. We're looking at today's imperialism. The why is UK and US imperialism propping up Israel. We're looking at Zionism and anti-Semitism, etc. So we're going to have a number of really good, interesting speakers. The Arab revolutions, Nasser, etc. Sort of Arab nationalism. So really looking forward to it, and we'll hope you see you next week. We're starting with a roundtable with Moshe Machova, Tony Greenstein, and Roger Silverman. Thank you very much, comrades. Thank you very much, Ian. It was a really good last session to sum it all up. Thank you, comrades. Bye-bye.